Evening. We are in Luke chapter 9 again tonight. So the disciples are arguing about which one of them is going to be the greatest. And Jesus interrupts them and he brings over a small child. And he says, "Whoever will welcome this small child in my name is the greatest. Whoever is the least among you is the greatest." Now, contextually, children in those days were almost disregarded. I mean, they were the lowest of the low. And so Jesus is saying, whoever is willing to be last, whoever is willing to serve the least, who's ever willing to always put others in front of themselves, that person is going to be the greatest. I mean, they're actually going to see the greatest movements of God through their life. And yet I think most of us aren't living that way. And maybe that's why we don't see God move that drastically through our lives. I think most of us focus much of our time and attention on our self-promotion, on self-advancement, on a whole lot of self things. Right? We just want to be first. If you bring someone in from another culture and you say, "What do you think of these Americans?" They're probably not going to say, "Yeah, they're always the people that put others first. That's just not us." Now, at this point in Luke, in chapters 8 and 9, both of those chapters tend to track almost in parallel with Mark chapters 8 and 9. Their stories at this point in their books are almost identical. And in the same larger section in Mark, Jesus makes this sort of summary statement to the disciples that I think serves as a really good summary of what we as a church have been covering the last 2 months. He says to the disciples, "Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod." Now, maybe some of you have never baked or cooked anything in your life. You're like, what is even, like, what's yeast? Yeast is something that's going to spread all throughout the dough. And Jesus is saying, if you let in the ways, the teachings of the Pharisees or the ways of Herod into your life, it's going to ruin your life. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with some of those people. The Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. And so they were overly focused on rules. They thought if they just accomplished enough rules, they could earn their way to God through their obedience. And of course, so much of what we've covered in the last few months is Jesus counteracting that by saying, no, it's grace that allows us to come to God. It's not, we don't get to God by our own obedience. But Jesus, in the last few chapters, has spent almost as much time contrasting against the yeast of Herod, the ways of Herod. And I just wonder if we as Americans are even hearing that bit. Like, we can talk about the Pharisees thing because, honestly, I don't think that's even that challenging for us. But there's not a lot of legalistic people even left in churches. But maybe it's the ways of Herod that are even more challenging for us. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Herod, he was the ruler of Galilee and Perea. So the Galilee was the region where Jesus did most of his teaching in. And for Jesus, Herod was this symbol of those who just wanted to live for money and power and pleasure, the things of this world, right? And Herod was almost the exact opposite of what Jesus has been teaching in Luke 9, which is self-denial. Because Herod tried to accomplish greatness by being great himself, where Jesus is teaching his disciples that you actually accomplish greatness by denying yourself and making God look great instead. And so I think as we kind of come to this end of this section of Luke 9, we're going to take a break from Luke for a month or two here as a church. As we kind of come to the end of this section, I want you to spend some time in small group tonight just discussing, are you as an individual, or maybe you all as a group, are you more apt to struggle with the yeast of the Pharisees or the yeast of Herod? And I pray that the Lord leads you away from that and instead to live out the teachings of Jesus. Amen.